In the last lesson, we talked about the arrangement of ideas in a text being driven by an audience's needs. We also discussed a general five-stage or five-goal model that can be used in virtually every situation that requires an argument and works especially well in essays. But the study of what makes the order of ideas effective in a text and how to best go about arranging them has been going on for a long time. So today we're going to look at two different established models of arrangement. The first one comes to us all the way from ancient Greece and the other from the 20th century. But before we go any further, let's go ahead and pause the video at this time to complete the reflection activity. Reflect on the following question in a paragraph, writing informally and off the top of your head. When you're finished writing your reflection, go ahead and unpause the video to continue the lesson. Now let's take some notes. The first model we'll look at is the classical model, which is a model of arrangement that was developed by the ancient Greeks over 2,500 years ago. And it was used extensively by the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans in their political bodies. But it's influenced argumentative writing ever since, and we still see people using the classical model today. The classical model was traditionally used to argue a position within a debatable issue, and usually that would be some kind of an issue on what should or should not be done. So that's why it was so popular in political forums, but today it's used just for any debate over the potential future. Some of the basic principles behind the classical model include this, that the audience must first be well informed of the facts before they can consider an argument. Also, that an audience must understand the general principles of an argument before hearing specific reasoning. So in the classical model, a lot of times orators or arguers would lay out their underlying assumptions for their arguments ahead of time and then apply those to their specific reasons. Lastly, the audience should hear the reasons supporting the writer's claim and also rebuttals of the opposing side. That was expected in the classical model. Applied to our five-stage general understanding of how to effectively arrange an argument, according to the classical model, engaging the audience, that first stage or goal, should involve introducing the topic under discussion, establishing a position or thesis, making the issue seem urgent and making the writer's position seem something that is vital. And they called this part of the classical model, they had a name for it, they called it the exordium. According to the classical model as well, priming the audience, that stage, involved providing background information, establishing the facts within the debate, establishing the general principles that will guide the argument, that's those underlying assumptions. And the ancient Greeks called this part of the argument the narratio. Next, the guiding the audience through the argument or analysis stage. Here, the writer would make a series of arguments that supported their thesis, and the Greeks called this the confirmatio. They would then acknowledge and rebut the opposing arguments, and they called that part the refutatio. In the next phase here, leading the audience to the argument's conclusion, really a lot like our conclusions today. The classical model involves recapping the arguments and rebuttals made, usually in a rather extended section, and then reaffirming the thesis. So it's a very formal conclusion, similar to the ones you've been taught to write. And then in that last stage, making the audience care about the conclusion, here in the classical model, the writer would reiterate the urgency of the issue, reiterate the vitalness that the audience accept the thesis. And these final two stages of leading the audience to the conclusion and making them care about it, those two stages combined were what the ancient Greeks called the peroratio. Let's go ahead and pause the video at this time to complete our first exercise. Here, you're going to read a new text and practice analyzing the text arrangement using the classical model. You're just going to respond to some questions about the arrangement using complete sentences. When you're finished with the exercise, go ahead and unpause the video and we'll go over some sample responses together. All right, question one asked about the first of the five stages. The writers here engage the audience in paragraphs 1, 2, and 3, and they typify this exordium part of the classical model by doing a few things. They introduce a debatable issue, the renewal of civics education in the United States. They present that debatable issue as something urgent to the health of American democracy, there in paragraph 2. They present their thesis, their need to fix this problem as vital by suggesting that Americans would perhaps be hypocritical to do so much to promote a democracy abroad without promoting it here at home. And that's in paragraph 3. Question 2 asks about the next stage or goal, and the writers prime the audience in this text in paragraphs 4 through 8. Here the writers typify the narratio of the classical model by doing a few things. They give the facts behind the issue in the form of testing data that suggests that American students today, or back in 2006 when the text was written, are poorly educated in civics, and that's from paragraph 4. They also establish the general principle that democracy can only survive when citizenship is taught alongside other subjects. That's in paragraph 5, and that general principle is going to be necessary for them to make their arguments in the next part. They also provide some background information, some history about how civics used to be taught, that while civics used to be taught in schools and used to be a very big focus in schools when public schools were first created, that practice has largely stopped today. And all we're left with is a government class that just talks about the structures of government. Moving on to the next stage, the writers guide the audience through the argument in paragraphs 9 through 13. And in this part, they typify the confirmatio of the classical model by doing a number of things. First, they propose that the central issue be fixed by reinstating civics education, not only in core classes, but also in extracurricular activities. They also back up the need for this action by arguing that civics learning will help students develop the attitudes necessary for success in college and life beyond. They also argue that civics learning will help strengthen the nation's economy and global position as a technological innovator. And then lastly, in paragraph 12, they lend authority to their arguments by noting that Bill Gates has advocated for civics education as well. They continue guiding the audience through the argument by using the refutatio part of the classical model, and that takes place in paragraph 13. Just the one paragraph. They only counter one counter argument here. They acknowledge the biggest opposing argument, which is that American education is often said that it needs to focus more on STEM and basic literacy. But they rebut that argument by arguing that there is room to support civics education in addition to pushing STEM and basic literacy. Moving on to the fourth phase, the writers lead the audience to the conclusion of the argument at the start of paragraph 14. Here they typify a part of the peroratio of the classical model by reiterating their thesis that America needs its students to be prepared for the responsibilities that come with citizenship. And we should note here that with such a short essay, there would be no need for the authors to recap all their confirmatio and refutatio before reiterating the thesis. So that's why you don't see that here, is because this is a short essay. The writers finally make the audience care about the conclusion with the remainder of paragraph 14. Here they continue to typify that other part of the peroratio of the classical model by reiterating the vitalness of civics education through reminding us that America claims to be this beacon of liberty in a tumultuous world. It's sort of once again suggesting that we would be hypocritical not to practice what we preach at home. Okay, let's continue taking some notes. The other established model that we're going to look at in this lesson is the Rogerian model, which is a model of arrangement developed first by psychiatrist Carl Rogers in the 60s and 70s, and then a lot of other people have tweaked it over the years. It was originally a model for negotiation and reconciliation, but it's been adapted into a means of arranging an argument since then. The basic principles behind the Rogerian model are that rather than win an argument, the writer must instead seek an understanding that is mutually satisfying with the opposition. It requires that the writer make the opposition feel heard and understood and find the areas of common ground with the opposition. When applied to our 5 stages of effective arrangement, under the Rogerian model, engaging the audience looks a lot like it does with the classical model, introducing the topic under discussion, establishing a thesis. However, it's also necessary under the Rogerian model that you build ethos with the opposition, making them feel understood and necessary to this discussion. When priming the audience under the Rogerian model, you must demonstrate an understanding of the opposition's general beliefs, as well as demonstrate an understanding of the various opposing arguments that the opposition have. You also want to make concessions throughout this part, and also just generally demonstrate a respect for the opposing position. When you guide the audience through the argument, you need to present arguments and counter arguments that develop your thesis, of course, but you also need to look for any ways that you can find common ground with the opposition, finding ways that what you want and what they want overlap so that you can ultimately demonstrate that you and the opposition want the same thing. When you're leading the audience to the argument's conclusion under the Rogerian model, this looks exactly like it does in most other models of arrangement. You recap your arguments and rebuttals that you've made, reaffirm your thesis. And in the last stage, making the audience care about the conclusion, here you need to explain how the opposition isn't surrendering their beliefs by going along with your thesis, and also explaining just how the thesis actually benefits the opposition in some way, and just finally building more ethos with the opposition, much like you do in the introduction. It's time to pause the video one more time to complete the next exercise in this lesson. Here you're going to practice analyzing the arrangement of a new text using the Rogerian model. You'll just answer some more questions like you did before using complete sentences. When you're finished with this exercise, of course, go ahead and unpause the video and we'll go over some sample responses together. Question 1 asks about the first of the 5 stages or goals, and the writer engages the audience in this text in just paragraph 1, really. You could look at this a bunch of different ways, but if we're trying to really separate out those 5 stages, and again, those stages can overlap a little bit, but if we want to just separate them out completely, yeah, just paragraph 1 is the introduction that engages the audience here. In this very short paragraph, they do typify the Rogerian model by introducing the topic that creation is threatened, by establishing a general position, which is that the audience's help is needed to save creation, and by building ethos. They even build ethos in those very short sentences by flattering the audience through suggesting that their help on the issue is important. Question 2, the writer primes the audience in this text in paragraphs 2 through 6. Here they typify the Rogerian model by demonstrating a detailed understanding of the opposition's beliefs and how they differ from the writers, and they do that throughout paragraphs 2 through 6. They also concede that they agree with the opposition in their beliefs that all people ought to have safety, freedom, respect, and something higher than themselves to believe in. That's also a way of showing common ground. And also by treating the opposition's beliefs with respect by using accurate and serious language when describing them. Question 3. The writer guides the audience through the argument in paragraphs 7 through 17. And they typify the Rogerian model here by establishing the common ground that concern for the environment transcends faith and ideology. They argue that if human beings continue to harm the environment the way they have been, that numerous species will soon become extinct, which will have a terrible impact on humanity and on creation. They also argue that the audience, as a religious leader, has the power to help change this outcome. They continue by questioning the ethics of ignoring the needs of Earth and focusing solely on the afterlife, and next offer an alternative viewpoint for Christians who believe this way. Instead, the writers say they should focus on helping improve the way people live in the here and now. Finally, the writer addresses the connection that many Christians make between environmentalism and their dispute with Darwin's theory of evolution. And ultimately, they demonstrate common ground with the audience by noting that Darwin revered nature in the same way when he was a Christian as he did after he abandoned Christianity, suggesting that a desire to protect nature can be shared by both Christians and non-Christians alike. Next, question 4. The writer leads the audience to the conclusion of their argument in paragraphs 19 through 20. Although it should be noted that since this is the first chapter of a book, the full argument is not really concluded, and it kind of leads into or introduces a whole new line of reasoning in the very last paragraph. And that's again because this is chapter 1 of a much longer book. However, in this part, they do typify the Rogerian model by reiterating that the audience is needed to help defeat this threat to creation, and also reiterating that they and the audience, while not necessarily in agreement on everything that the writer will argue in the book, they are at least in agreement on purpose, finding that common ground there. Finally, question 5, the writer makes the audience care about the conclusion. Again, in paragraphs 19 through 20, they all kind of mix up the last two stages of effective arrangement. And here they typify the Rogerian model by pointing out that many of the audience's fellow Christians of all different denominations are beginning to see how environmental conservation does align with their beliefs, and that support is growing. So that, of course, is designed to help the audience realize that they're not giving up their beliefs by agreeing with the writer, because look around them, their peers are already believing in this. And then lastly, demonstrating an enthusiasm. The writer demonstrates enthusiasm for learning more about the, quote, religious argument on behalf of creation. So again, building that ethos by appearing to be enthusiastic of learning more about the opposing position. All right, go and move on now to the practice activity at the end of the lesson, where you're going to be analyzing the arrangement of another text by discussing the elements of the classical and the Rogerian models that you see in that text. When you're finished with this practice activity, you're finished with the lesson.